Isis was an Egyptian goddess who was widely worshipped by Romans throughout the empire. Temples to Isis have been discovered not just in Egypt, but as far away as Pompeii. What was so appealing about this foreign cult? Isis is usually shown as an attractive woman wearing the stepped crown of Upper and Lower Egypt and carrying an ankh, or a symbol of life, in her hand. Here she is shown on a papyrus scroll from Egypt. Isis is standing in front of an enormous pile of offerings laid out before her. Her sacred animal was the ibis, a type of bird, which was worshipped by the Egyptians as the physical incarnation of the goddess herself. Isis was goddess of the river Nile, the most important river in Egypt, which runs from the south up to the Mediterranean Sea. Trade and transport used this great waterway through Egypt and beyond to Rome. Isis had her main temple at Philae on the river Nile. Here she somehow regulated the flow of the river Nile. This is very important for the Egyptians, since the silt which the Nile spreads on its banks in the spring enabled crops to be grown on the sides of the river. This picture shows the narrow strip of fertile agricultural land on the banks of the Nile. In the distance you can see the rocky outcrops of the mountains beyond. Every spring the river Nile flooded its banks, bringing down silt from the mountains. This mosaic shows the Nile in flood. Isis was thought to cause this rebirth of the riverbanks because of an ancient myth. Originally Isis had been married to Osiris. Osiris had taken on the form of a human being and had descended to earth. Here he was set upon and killed, and his body chopped into pieces and scattered throughout the earth. However, Isis had gone round and collected all the pieces. Magically she had restored his body to health, and the two, Isis and Osiris, had had a son called Horus. This ability to bring life after death was Isis's most important attribute, and was one of the main reasons why she was worshipped so much by the Romans. None of the Roman state gods promised anything after death. Osiris is sometimes depicted as the Roman god Serapis. Serapis wears a special crown shaped like a corn measuring jar. This reflects his wife's Isis ability to cause the fertile soils necessary for the growing of corn, the staple diet of most Romans. Egypt was the most important country in the Mediterranean for growing corn for the Romans. Much of the corn was sent to Rome by huge ships which left the mouth of the Nile at cities like Alexandria and travelled across to Rome itself. Without the corn supply, Rome would go hungry. So Isis was worshipped very much by sailors who hoped that she would keep the seas safe for them in their ships. Every March there was a huge procession in Alexandria, in which a golden statue of Isis was carried down to the harbour side and placed on a gold-plated ship. The ship sailed out into the sea as the priests of Isis prayed for safe sailing conditions. This image shows 4 members of the procession. On the left is a woman. She is waving a sistrum, the sacred rattle, which makes a tinkling sound. This instrument was used exclusively in the worship of Isis. In her other hand she carries a temple trumpet. Next to her is a man carrying a jar of holy water from the river Nile. This water is so precious that he must not touch even the jar with his bare hands. Therefore he has folded his toga over his hands so as not to touch the jar. The next figure is carrying a sacred scroll. The worship of Isis required its participants to read holy books and learn them by heart. In the temple precincts were reading and dining rooms where initiates, people who had chosen to worship Isis, met regularly to eat together and to read the sacred stories. At the front of the procession is another woman who carries a sacred snake coiled around her hand and a small box or purse which contains the secret objects used in the ceremonies. Only those people who had passed the tests of initiation were allowed to see these objects. What is important about this procession is the indication it gives us of the use of ritual objects, sacred musical instruments like the sistrum, holy water from the Nile, sacred books, and ritual objects. Only the initiates would know what these things were for. To be a member of Isis was to be a part of a very special club. No doubt the members would help each other in times of difficulty. This was not what happened in the normal religious practices of Rome, and this perhaps goes some way to explaining the appeal of the religion to Romans. The Temple of Isis at Pompeii is one piece of evidence for the worship of Isis. The temple stands on a high podium reached by a set of steps. It stands inside a walled precinct with dining rooms and meeting rooms. We can imagine a number of priests living here, teaching new initiates the mysteries of the religion. In front of the temple is an unusual building, which was the place where the sacred water from the Nile was kept. This is rather like a font in a modern church. A wall painting from Herculaneum shows the mourning ceremony in front of a temple of Isis, very similar to the one in Pompeii. The temple itself is standing on a set of high steps. At the top, the door is flanked by two sphinxes, symbols of Egypt. 3 priests stand at the top of the steps. These priests are interesting. Firstly, there are both men and women there. Women as well as men were allowed to become priests of Isis, unlike in Roman state religion. Secondly, one of the priests is black. It was unusual for foreigners to take part in Roman state religious practices. One of the ways of identifying a male priest of Isis was by his bald head. Men shaved their scalp. At the bottom of the steps, 2 Isis birds represent the presence of the goddess Isis. On the left, the choir master is at work. Choral singing was an important part of worship of Isis. The man in the middle is either conducting the choir or is telling them to stop. Finally, the priest at the bottom is making a sacrifice. These musical instruments, found in Pompeii, were used in the worship of Isis. You can see cymbals and sistra, or rattles. This Roman statue shows Isis rattling the sistrum. We do not exactly know what happened in the worship of Isis, nor do we know how a person became an initiate. This was kept secret, even to death. The Roman writer Apuleius, seen here, wrote a novel in which, after many adventures, he was turned into a donkey. Desperate to turn back into a human being, he was visited by an apparition of Isis and became her follower. Turned back into a human being, even then he refused to tell the story of what it was that had happened during the initiation ceremony. These paintings from Pompeii show something of the ritual, but their meaning can only be guessed at. Whatever happened must have had a powerful hold over the followers of Isis. The goddess of the river Nile, flooding, fertility and safe shipping, was really at her most powerful when the Romans believed that she promised life after death. These mummy paintings from Egypt show Roman faces of men and women as they looked or they liked to appear at their deaths. Wrapped in bandages, Romans in Egypt continued the Egyptian practice of mummification in the hope of a decent afterlife. These paintings from Pompeii, in the Temple of Isis, showed what they thought the afterlife might be like. No punishment in Tartarus, or a boring death forever in the shady underworld, such as the Roman state religion suggested, but instead a world of beauty and peace and tranquillity, in an ideal landscape where nothing was missed out and nothing was forgotten, a land pretty much like our own vision of heaven.